a lot of people do not talk about is the fact that the Bible has a lot of different types of literature in it. People misinterpret and misapply the Bible because they don't understand how that specific piece of literature is supposed to be read and applied. So just like we today read poems and news articles very differently, we're also supposed to read different books of the Bible differently. So today we're going to talk about how to read the Bible's literary styles and watch as it transforms our Bible study life. And hang out until the end where we're going to talk about the epistles, and it will blow your mind. I think people are just too scared to talk about this. So let's dive in. Hey friends, today we're talking about how to read the Bible's literary styles. We're just talking about the different literature in the Bible. We've got narrative, we've got historical narrative, we've got poems, we've got wisdom literature, there's apocalyptic literature, there's all different kinds of stuff. Now, before I dive into the very first type of literature in the Bible, it's really important to recognize that ancient Near Eastern poems aren't supposed to be read like modern day poems. And ancient Near Eastern history isn't supposed to be read like modern day history. So let me unpack that just a little bit. So like modern history textbook, what would you expect when you open the book? You would expect to see a lot of dates, a lot of specific locations, a lot of specific people listed out, very cause and effect oriented. Well, ancient Near Eastern history wasn't as scientific as we are. We're very about specific person, specific time, specific location. Ancient Near East, they didn't value that as much as we do. Their history served the purpose of defining who they are and their purpose in their life to be kind of a testimony of God's involvement in their life. You'll see in the historical narrative in the Bible that it's a lot about what God did in their life or what God was doing in their people's story, in Israel's story, and a little bit less exact about the dates. For example, like in the Gospels, you rarely find a specific date. So it's important to recognize that while we may call this a poem or while we may call it a historical narrative, we can't go into it expecting out of it what modern day historical narratives would have in it. Okay? So first type of literature I wanted to talk about, obviously we can't talk about all the different literature in the Bible today. I can unpack this in further videos, or honestly, you can check out these books here on the screen for more information. One of the first things I want to talk about was poetry, because I think this is a huge misconception that I've always had and probably a lot of y'all have always had. And so I wanted to share this. This is really helpful when you're reading the Psalms, when you're reading Song of Solomon, when you're reading all the poetry that's randomly dispersed in the New Testament. Poetry in the ancient Near East, now remember, not a lot of people read and not a lot of people wrote, right? So poetry was recited, people heard it and sang it and memorized it that way. There was no writing down the poetry, carrying it in your journal. Poetry was directly correlated with singing, and singing was directly correlated to worship. So poetry was directly correlated to worship. Poetry nowadays is very this is how I'm feeling. And poetry in the ancient Near East, it was very worship oriented. It was very let me remind myself who I am, whose I am, and who is the winner, who comes out as king, God. It was also prayers. And you just don't find that. Even poems that today aren't even just a journal entry. They're very artsy, am I right? So I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but I really hope that helps you in your reading of the Psalms. Prophecy in the Bible is also very different than I think what a lot of people understand prophecy to be in the Bible. How often have you heard someone take Revelation and they find one little obscure verse and they're like, this must be the blah, blah, blah that we have in the modern day. That means Jesus is coming right now. And I would always be hesitant to immediately embrace something like that. You will constantly find I feel like this is a harsh term, but it's totally legit, false prophets. You'll find them all the time on YouTube. You'll find them all the time on late night television. I remember growing up and someone said a beast in Revelation that had 2 horns. That's clearly the TV, because TVs, when I was a little kid, had 2 antennae. And nowadays TVs don't even have antennas. You're searching so hard in the prophetic literature to honestly find something that maybe that wasn't the purpose. So prophetic literature really didn't serve the purpose to be a puzzle for us to sit there and try and figure out. Rather, prophecy was given usually usually as a rebuke, as part of some kind of punishment, as part of some kind of discipline from God. And it was usually given to remind the people whose they were God's, what they needed to do. They needed to obey God, and who wins out in the end? God wins out in the end. That was typically like the overarching message given in prophecy. Let's look at like the prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. Jesus fulfilled like random prophecies, like random prophecy here, and like the rest of the chapter is still kind of gibberishy if we're gonna be completely honest with ourselves. He didn't fulfill every single verse that was in the chapter. So it's not like we need to open up the book of Revelation and look for modern day examples of every little verse. And that's not the purpose of prophecy in the Bible. We're supposed to read it and be reminded to run to the Lord. He wins out in the end. He is our God. We are his. Wisdom literature, like the Proverbs, were short, pithy statements. It's like a big compilation of wisdom. Has anybody ever given you one of those Christian books and they just have like quotes from Christian leaders? You got like Charles Spurgeon here, and then you have like Mother Teresa there on the other page, and it's like pretty pictures of flowers, and it's like every day you like turn the page and you have like a new Christian quote for the day. Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? Okay, so it's like that. That's what Proverbs is like. It's like we took every single one of those quotes that we would have in our little calendar book thing, and you just put them verse by verse, and that is what is in our Bible. Just like we would say like haste makes waste as like a piffy little cute wisdom statement, it doesn't always apply to all situations. I said this in a recent video, but like if I called 911, I really hope the ambulance driver wouldn't say, well, haste makes waste, I better take my time. I really hope you would be booking it to my house. Same thing. In the Proverbs, we can't always take every single verse and apply it to every single situation of life. That's not what that literature was intended to do. It's a compilation of random wisdom quotes, and yet it still holds authority. It's still God's inerrant word, but we have to be wise when applying the wisdom literature. Now let's talk about the epistles. I feel like I never hear this because I feel like people are too afraid or scared to share it, but they're letters intended for a specific audience in a specific church. And sometimes the writer had the general understanding that the letter would be passed around from church to church, or at least read aloud to the church. Because again, people couldn't read or write, right? But they were often written to a specific situation, a specific cultural period. So we have to be wise when reading the epistles on certain verses and certain applications. So like for example, 1 Corinthians 11. I'm not in a denomination that views these verses about women needing to wear head coverings as something that still applies to all believers. Some people view these verses as verses that were intended for all believers of all time, so women still need to wear head coverings to this day. That is because there are differences on understanding where in the epistles does it apply to all believers and where in the epistles are the letters just applying to that specific church and that specific cultural moment. And to make it even more confusing, oftentimes the epistles weren't actually written by the people that we attribute them to. The letters were often verbally given to a scribe, and the scribe wrote the letters down. Make it even more confusing, some people argue that 1st and 2nd Peter were written after Peter's death by his scribe, just like a compilation of all his sermonic creedal statements and things like that that needed to be sent to that church to encourage them in the faith. That gets kind of scary, right? That gets kind of confusing when you're like, wait, does this hold authority in my life? Is this God's inerrant word? Yes, but be encouraged. We're going to talk about this on Monday in our video about canonization. If you have any more questions about how to really understand the background, the historical situation, what kind of literature am I reading right now in this specific verse, you can watch this video, and you can always check out this playlist to see me kind of put this all to action.